Welcome, and make yourself comfortable. Tonight, we are going to travel back into the dim, smoky rooms of the medieval world. Before we begin, I invite you to pull your blanket around you, settle into a soft position, and let the present fade into the background. As you listen, I'd love for you to subscribe to this channel so you never miss another quiet journey into history. Leave a comment below too. Tell us where in the world you are tuning in from. It's always calming to see how many of us are drifting into the past together. Now, close your eyes halfway and imagine lying in a medieval house. The sounds of today are slowly slipping away, replaced by the creak of old wooden beams, the smoky smell of the hearth, and the crunch of straw beneath tired bodies. We will explore how couples live together in homes without walls or doors, places built for survival rather than privacy. These small one-room cottages held families, animals, and secrets all pressed close together. And yet inside them, people still tried to love, to touch, and to share quiet moments of closeness. This story is not one of fiery passion or great drama. Instead, it is a gentle look at daily life, the awkwardness, the tenderness, the quiet inventiveness of intimacy in a world without privacy. So let us begin. Picture the fire dying low, the night pressing in, and everyone gathered in one room. Within that crowded space, love and closeness still tried to find a place to live. The one-room home at night is midnight in a medieval village. The fire that once glowed in the center of the room has long since faded to ashes. Only a few orange sparks remain, glowing faintly like sleepy stars in the hearth. Around the fire, 10 people are asleep. They're breathing uneven, their bodies bundled together against the chill. There are no separate bedrooms. Instead, this single room is everything. The kitchen, the living room, and the sleeping quarters. Grandparents lie close to the wall, wrapped in coarse wool. Children curl near their parents for warmth. Servants take their place where space allows. Even the family's goat is tied by the hearth, its soft bleating a reminder that animals lived close to humans. The floor is covered with straw. Some of it is fresh, though most is flattened and mixed with dust. The scent of it lingers in the air, heavy with the warmth of bodies. People sleep on rough mattresses stuffed with reeds or hay. A few lucky ones might have a thin wool blanket, but pillows are rare. Heads rest on folded cloths or on an arm bent beneath the cheek. The house itself is small, built of timber or stone depending on the region. In the north, turf and earth pack the walls, keeping out the worst of the wind. In the south, wood frames and wattle panels form a lighter structure. The roof above is thatched with straw, which rustles softly whenever a mouse scurries across. A hole in the roof lets out smoke, but it also lets in cold air and sometimes rain. Now imagine yourself lying there, the weight of the day still heavy on your body. You hear the sigh of your neighbor beside you, the shift of feet in the straw, the crackle of cooling embers. Privacy does not exist. Every movement, every sound belongs to everyone in the room. Somewhere in the dark, a husband reaches for his wife. Slowly, carefully, he shifts his body so as not to disturb the others. There are no walls to hide behind, no blankets thick enough to muffle sound. Silence is both shield and prison. He must move gently, quietly, hoping that sleep has claimed the rest of the room. This was the reality of life in one-room homes. Families lived together as a single unit, sharing warmth and space, but losing the idea of privacy we take for granted today. To us, it may feel impossible. To them, it was simply normal. The medieval night was long, stretching for hours in the cold. Candles were costly, so darkness ruled. The rhythm of life followed the seasons. Longer nights in winter, shorter in summer. In these nights, couples tried to carve out small moments of closeness, surrounded by the breathing and shifting of their family. For them, intimacy was not about luxury, but survival of the bond. It was not passion behind closed doors, but tenderness carried out under the gaze of shadows and silence. A hand found another hand. A whisper was lost in the crackle of a dying fire as we begin this story. Remember that this crowded, smoky, straw-covered room was the stage of daily life. Every meal, every argument, every illness, every birth, and every attempt at closeness happened here. This was the world in which couples tried to love. Love without privacy. So how did love survive in a world where there was nowhere to be alone? When the body still yearned, and desire whispered louder than shame, where did intimacy go to hide? There were no bedrooms. In most medieval homes, even, the word room was a luxury to begin. Imagine the home once again. The same smoky hall, the same family breathing together in one space. You can picture the straw beneath you, the dampness that clings to the air in winter, the faint odor of animals that share the shelter. Every sound carries. If someone coughs, the whole house hears. If a child stirs in the night, every ear notices. In such a world, where could love find its corner? Couples did not wait for walls. They found ways, even when none seemed possible. In truth, love in the medieval home was never private, in the sense we know it today. Instead, it was quiet, cautious, and often improvised. Theirs was intimacy shaped not by comfort, but by circumstance. The church preached that marriage was sacred, that physical union had a holy purpose. Children were to be born, families to be continued, society to be ordered. Yet priests also warned against excess. They told couples that too much fondness, too much laughter in bed, too much pleasure was sinful. The bed was not supposed to be about joy, but about duty. And yet, people are people. They found ways to turn necessity into closeness, rules into gentle rebellion. Let us think of the ordinary peasant couple. Perhaps they were married in the parish church with neighbours standing as witnesses. After the wedding, they returned not to a private honeymoon chamber, but to the same crowded house. Some villages even held bedding ceremonies. At these, friends and family escorted the new couple to their shared bed, watching as they lay together, sometimes even joking and singing to confirm that the marriage was real. Privacy began with an audience. Yet once the ceremony ended and life settled back into its rhythm, couples faced the same problem as before. There was simply no space to be alone. A table by day might be pulled aside at night to create a sleeping place. A blanket laid across straw became a shared mattress. The parents, the children, and perhaps a servant or relative all stretched out together. Intimacy was never hidden. It was only managed, timed, and softened by silence court records. From the Middle Ages tell us many stories about these quiet attempts at love. In Yorkshire, one case mentions a woman who lay with her husband behind the bread oven because her house had no other private place. In Essex, a servant testified that she often overheard her master and mistress at night, separated from her only by a thin cloth. These small details show how common it was for intimacy to be witnessed, overheard, or guessed at by others. Privacy was so rare that couples invented barriers. When they could not build walls, they created illusions of space. A curtain strung across a wooden beam, a wool cloth pinned to a rafter, a mat woven from reeds and hung to separate one corner of the room. These were not soundproof, and everyone in the house still knew what was happening. But the curtain created a feeling, a sense that here, behind this fabric, something belonged only to the two of them. By the 15th century, records show that some wealthier peasants even owned bed curtains. These were sometimes listed in probate inventories alongside pots, pans, and tools. To us today, a curtain around a bed may seem small, but to them, it was precious. It made the bed into a chamber within the chamber, a tiny enclosed world where whispers and sighs could be shared without every eye upon them. Signals were another way couples managed intimacy. In a crowded home, you could not announce your wishes aloud, so people learned to use glances, objects, or movements as signs. A shoe turned upright near the bed, a lantern placed in a certain spot, a glance given at dusk. These gestures told a partner when it was safe to reach out, when the children were asleep, when the rest of the household was too tired to notice. The rhythm of the house itself became important. Couples waited for the right moment. When the baby was finally quiet, when the grandmother had drifted into heavy sleep, when the servants were away, when the fire had burned low enough to mask soft sounds. Intimacy was less about desire and more about patience, strategy, and timing. Sometimes, the house offered no space at all, so lovers stepped outside. Barns, bakehouses, mills, and fields at night became secret havens. They were cold, uncomfortable, and risky. A neighbor might walk by, a servant might stumble upon them, the weather might be bitter. Yet the freedom to be away from watching eyes was worth the discomfort. Legal records tell of couples caught in stables or behind mills. To modern ears, these may sound scandalous, but in truth, they were simply practical. In a one-room home, the only true privacy was often found outdoors. Class shaped these experiences in powerful ways. The poor had no choice but to share their smoky halls. But the wealthy began to build chambers. Lords and merchants added upper rooms with doors and locks. These solars, as they were called, gave the powerful what the peasants could never afford: the ability to close the door. Yet even there, privacy was never absolute. Servants still walked the halls. Gossip travelled quickly, and the thickest walls could not keep out the curiosity of others. The church also kept watch. Priests asked couples, in confession, if they had been too affectionate, if they had sought pleasure instead of procreation, if they had spoken wanton words. Intimacy was seen as necessary, but dangerous if pursued with joy. Fornication outside marriage, adultery within it, even laughter shared too privately could be punished by church courts. The home may have felt like a refuge, but in reality, it was porous. Thin boards let in sound, neighbors listened, and judgment was never far away. And yet, despite the lack of privacy, despite the rules and the watchful eyes, couples found moments of mercy. When the fire dimmed, when the room settled into silence, when the dark pressed close, the world seemed to fade. A hand slipped into another. A breath warmed a neck. Words were whispered so low that even the mice in the straw could not hear them. In those moments, intimacy survived. The important thing to remember is this: love in the medieval home was not loud, not flamboyant, not dramatic. It was small, careful, and inventive. It existed not because the world made it easy, but because couples chose to make space for each other in the narrow margins of their lives. This tells us something simple but powerful. Human beings have always sought closeness, no matter how crowded the house, no matter how strict the rules, no matter how loud the neighbors. People found ways to love: curtains, signals, whispered words in the night. These were the tools of intimacy in a world without privacy. When you think of it this way, intimacy becomes less about the place and more about the choice. Two people surrounded by family, by animals, by cold air and smoky beams, could still carve out a moment that belonged only to them. The walls may have been missing, but the bond was still there. And as you imagine that world, lying in the smoky dark, straw beneath you, fire fading beside you, remember that these couples were not so different from us. They too wanted tenderness. They too longed for closeness. And they too found it, even in the most crowded of homes. The shape of a medieval home, what we call a single room today, was often the entire house in the medieval world. To understand why intimacy was so difficult, we need to first look carefully at the shape, structure, and rhythm of these homes. Imagine stepping inside one, ducking beneath the low wooden beams, and letting your eyes adjust to the dim light. Most houses in medieval villages were built from what was available nearby. In England, timber frames filled with wattle and daub were common. Wattle was a woven lattice of thin branches, usually hazel or willow, plastered over with daub, a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and even animal dung. In colder northern regions, where wood was scarcer, homes were built of stone, turf, or packed earth. In either case, the houses were simple, functional, and often damp. A typical peasant house was rectangular. Imagine a long, narrow box set on The earth perhaps 20 feet by 10, though size varied depending on wealth. The roof was steeply pitched and covered with thatch, which kept out rain, but not always mice or birds. Inside, the space was usually one large open room, with no real division except what the family created with furniture or fabric. At the center of this room was the fire. The hearth was not just for cooking, it was the beating heart of the household. Without it, there was no warmth, no food, no light. A shallow pit held the flames, and smoke rose upward to find its way out through a hole in the roof, though much of it lingered. This meant that the air inside was always hazy, heavy with the smell of wood smoke and the faint sting that made eyes water. Your clothes, your hair, even your skin absorbed the scent of the fire. Around the hearth, the family gathered for nearly everything. The cooking pot hung on a chain or stood on a tripod above the flames. Meals were eaten on low wooden tables or benches. Children played on the packed earth floor. Adults sat to mend tools, spin wool, or tell stories. And at night, when darkness fell and candles were far too precious to waste, the family stretched out to sleep. Let us pause here and picture that sleeping arrangement. Beds as we know them, separate, raised, cushioned, were rare luxuries. A few households had wooden frames topped with straw mattresses, sometimes called pallets, but many simply slept on the ground, with straw or reeds spread directly on the earthen floor. This straw was changed only a few times a year, so it was usually flattened, mixed with dirt and home to insects. A thin blanket of wool might cover the sleepers, though in many households, one blanket was shared among several people. The result was a crowded, noisy, and often uncomfortable sleeping space. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes servants, or boarders all lay together. Even animals were often brought inside during cold nights, tied near the hearth for warmth and protection. The goat or cow lowed softly, the dog shifted, the chickens clucked on their perch. In this one room, human and animal life mingled together, each body adding to the warmth and each sound echoing through the silence. Privacy, in this setting, was not just rare, it was unimaginable. The very idea of having a separate bedroom would have seemed extraordinary to most villagers. Life was shared, from waking at dawn to sleeping at night. The family was a unit, bound together by necessity, survival, and space. There was no expectation that individuals could carve out their own territory. Let us imagine what this means for intimacy. If you were a young couple, newly married, you would share your nights with children at your feet, in-laws a few paces away, and servants within earshot. There would be no shutting the door, no drawing the curtains, no slipping away to another chamber. The fire's glow reached everywhere, and the darkness belonged to everyone. Every cough, every whisper, every shift of straw was heard. In some regions, houses developed a little more complexity. By the late Middle Ages, wealthier peasants and townsfolk sometimes built homes with 2 stories. The lower level housed animals, or work areas, while the family lived above. Others added a loft or gallery reached by a ladder where children might sleep. Yet even here, walls were thin, space was tight, and sound travelled easily. The loft gave a small sense of division, but not true privacy. In Scandinavia, longhouses were common. These were large rectangular buildings made of timber and turf, housing both people and animals under one roof. A long central fire pit ran down the middle, with benches and sleeping platforms along the sides. Families lived together in communal warmth, their lives blending with the animals they depended on. Here too, intimacy was shaped by the reality. Of open space furniture was minimal. A chest to store clothing, a bench or two, a table, perhaps a stool. Beds, when they existed, were more like platforms or boxes filled with straw. Sheets were rare, pillows almost unknown. People slept in shifts, with some rising early to tend animals, others sleeping late after long work in the fields. The house was never fully still. Even in towns and cities, homes were small and crowded. Narrow houses leaned over the street, built tall to save space. Yet inside, the same pattern appeared. 1 or 2 rooms, sometimes with a loft. Families packed close, together, Wealthy merchants and nobles enjoyed chambers, solas, and halls. But ordinary townsfolk lived much like peasants, with their lives exposed to family, neighbors, and servants alike. What strikes us most today is the lack of separation. In our modern world, we divide space into bedrooms, kitchens, bathrooms, and living rooms. Each function is given its own area. In the medieval home, everything happened in one place. You cooked, ate, worked, prayed, gave birth, and slept in the same smoky hall. To live in such closeness was not considered strange. It was simply the rhythm of life. And so, intimacy became not about shutting out the world, but about creating a moment within it. Couples did not expect privacy in the way we do. They learned to find quiet corners, to share looks and signals, to accept the presence of others while carving out what little they could for themselves. When we look back, it is easy to feel pity, to think of their lives as hard and loveless. But the truth is more nuanced. Love found a way. The lack of walls did not erase tenderness. If anything, it made it more resilient. For couples to be close in such conditions, they had to be patient, careful, and creative. The one-room house, then, was both a cage and a cradle. It restricted privacy, but nurtured family bonds. It forced people together, but also taught them to live as a single unit. And within that closeness, intimacy still survived. Not in grand gestures or private moments, but in whispers, in glances, and in the quiet bravery of choosing each other despite the crowd around them. So when we think of the medieval home, smoky and crowded, we see not just hardship, but also endurance. A family breathing as one, a fire burning at the center, straw beneath, thatch above, and somewhere in the shadows, two people carving out a small space of love in a world that left them no room. Beds were shared. In most medieval homes, a bed was not something private, not a place just for two. It was instead a shared surface, a mattress of straw laid on slats, or sometimes simply a layer of reeds spread on the floor. Families did not sleep apart. They slept together, bodies lined side by side, young and old, related and sometimes unrelated, all pressed into the same narrow space. If you imagine yourself stepping into one of these homes at night, you would see it clearly. By day, the room was full of activity. A table for meals, stools for sitting, perhaps a chest or two for storage. But as the sun set and the fire burned low, the furniture shifted. The table might be pushed aside, and the floor cleared. Then, mats, pallets, or loose straw would be spread out, ready for sleeping. Some households had wooden bed frames, though not many. A frame lifted the sleeper off the cold earth, which made a difference on damp nights. Onto the frame went a mattress stuffed with straw, reeds, or heather. These mattresses were lumpy, uneven, and often infested with insects. They had to be shaken, beaten, and restuffed regularly. But they gave some comfort compared to the hard floor in humbler homes. No frame existed. Instead, a thick layer of straw covered the ground, changed only a few times a year. This straw absorbed sweat, crumbs, dirt, and smoke. It was soft at first, but soon flattened. The smell of it mixed with the fire's smoke and the scent of unwashed bodies. It was the smell of daily life. On these beds, people lay close together. A blanket, if the family owned one, was spread across everyone. Sometimes 2 or 3 people shared a single covering, curling tight against the cold. Wool was rough, heavy, and often itchy, but it trapped warmth. In the coldest months, families huddled for survival, their shared body heat more important than comfort pillows, in the sense we know them, were rare. Some households stuffed cloth bags with feathers or wool, but most people rested their heads, on folded clothing or on their own arms. Sleep was not about softness. It was about getting through the night. Probate records, the lists of belongings made when someone died, show us how normal this was. Many wills mention only one bed in an entire house. That bed might be left to the eldest child, or to the widow, or to the family's heir. Curtains, if they existed, were listed alongside pots, tools, and livestock. They were possessions as valuable as any piece of furniture. The sharing of beds also extended beyond the family. Travelers, servants, and even strangers sometimes lay side by side. In inns, it was expected that you would share your bed with whomever was assigned to it. The idea of a bed as private property was slow to develop. In the medieval world, a bed was a communal space, not a personal one. This raises questions of intimacy. Imagine lying there, your children pressed against you, your parents only an arm's length away, a servant snoring on the other side of the room. Every sigh, every whisper, every shift in the straw was noticed. For a couple to seek closeness, they had to move silently, carefully, their love hidden beneath the same blanket that covered everyone else. It was not only the physical closeness that mattered, but also the awareness that others were listening. Thin partitions of fabric, a curtain strung on a beam, could hide the body from view, but not from sound. And so, intimacy became quiet. Couples learned to express love not through boldness, but through stillness and patience. In some regions, communal sleeping had even more ritual. A wedding night, for instance, rarely meant privacy. In some villages, neighbors and family members held what were called bedding ceremonies. They escorted the new couple to their bed, sometimes with singing or joking, to confirm that the marriage was real. In other places, the act of consummation itself was expected to be public, or at least witnessed. The idea of intimacy beginning with solitude was foreign. It began with community, yet for most ordinary nights, intimacy had no ritual. It had only obstacles. A husband and wife, lying together in a crowded bed, had to create their own privacy within the shared blanket. They might whisper so softly that even the grandmother sleeping nearby could not catch the words. They might turn their backs on the rest of the family, using the cover of darkness as their only shield. The rhythm of life was marked by work and fatigue. People rose at dawn and labored until dusk. By the time the household lay down to sleep, exhaustion weighed heavily. Children drifted into dreams quickly. Adults, sore from the fields or the loom, followed soon after. It was in these pockets of heavy sleep, when the room was finally quiet, that couples found a chance to reach for each other. The church, always concerned with morality, paid close attention to the bed. Priests reminded couples that the purpose of intimacy was to bring forth children. Pleasure for its own sake was frowned upon. Confessors asked men and women if they had been too playful, too fond, too eager. Yet despite these warnings, couples continued to seek tenderness. Even in the most crowded beds, they carved out their moments over time. Wealthier households began to develop more elaborate sleeping spaces. By the 15th century, four-poster beds with heavy curtains became symbols of status. These curtains shut out drafts and gave an illusion of privacy. A bed with curtains was a room within a room, a small enclosure where intimacy could exist more freely. But for the majority of peasants, privacy was still only a blanket strung across a beam, or the silence of night masking soft movements. To us, this way of sleeping may seem unimaginable. We think of a bed as a private retreat, a space to close the door and be alone. For medieval families, the bed was the opposite. It was the heart of the household, a place where everyone gathered, where warmth was shared, where life unfolded in full view of others. And yet, within this crowded, smoky, straw-covered space, love endured. It endured not because the world gave it comfort, but because people chose to nurture it anyway. Couples did not wait for solitude. They made it, with curtains, with patience, with whispered words that belonged only to them. The medieval bed reminds us that intimacy is not always about place, it is about presence. Even in a room filled with family, even in the absence of walls or softness, two people could still turn toward each other and find a moment that felt private. So when we imagine that crowded bed, with children nestled at the edges, grandparents breathing softly, servants lying close, and animals shifting nearby, we should not see only hardship. we should also see endurance. We should see the quiet strength of love that learned to exist, not in silence, but in whispers, not in solitude, but in closeness. Marriage in a crowded world, marriage unfolded in this crowded stage. Love tried to breathe in stale air, in a smoky room where every cough or shuffle was heard, where intimacy had to survive under the gaze of others. Unlike our modern ideas of wedding nights filled with privacy and romance, medieval marriages began under very different conditions. A wedding, for most ordinary villagers, was not a private event, but a public contract. It was less about two people whispering vows in secret, and more about families, neighbors, and communities recognizing a bond. When a man and woman married, they did so before witnesses in the parish church, or, in earlier centuries, sometimes, simply in the open air at the door of the church. The union was not hidden. It was displayed. Once the ceremony was done, the couple returned to their home, often the same one they had always lived in. In many cases, the new bride simply moved into the groom's family house, joining his parents, siblings, and perhaps grandparents under the same roof. Privacy was not created by marriage. It was made more difficult. Now the couple had to share their moments not only with each other, but with an extended household that was listening, watching, and living only a few feet away for some couples. Especially among the wealthier peasants and townsfolk, marriage came with a ritual known as the bedding ceremony. Neighbors and kin would accompany the bride and groom to their bed, sometimes singing, sometimes joking, and often staying long enough to make sure the marriage was properly begun. The act of intimacy itself might not have been seen, but the expectation of it was public knowledge. To us, this might feel intrusive, but in the medieval mindset, it confirmed the legitimacy of the marriage. The community was invested in the fertility of the couple, in the children who would follow, in the continuation of families and property. For poorer villagers, there was no grand bedding ceremony. Marriage was followed by daily life as usual, with the same chores, the same crowded beds, the same smoky halls. Intimacy, for them, was less about ritual and more about improvisation. A husband and wife might snatch a moment when others were out tending animals, or when the fire had burned. Low at night, the idea of privacy was not expected. In fact, many church courts in the Middle Ages heard cases about marriages and relationships precisely because the whole village often knew what was happening behind thin walls. Gossip carried fast. If a woman was suspected of being too close with her husband in ways that seemed joyful rather than dutiful, tongues wagged. If a man was seen slipping out to the barn with his wife, neighbors whispered. Intimacy was not hidden. It was observed, discussed, and sometimes judged. Yet despite this, couples still sought ways to be close. Consider the silence of a crowded room. Even in that silence, two people could find each other beneath a blanket. They might turn their backs on the others, using the cover of night. They might whisper so softly that only the person beside them could hear. In that moment, surrounded by family and servants, love became an act of quiet defiance. The church added another layer of complexity. Priests reminded married couples that intimacy was not just for pleasure, but for procreation. To lie together, without the hope of children, was considered sinful. Certain times were forbidden entirely. Sundays, feast days, Lent, Advent, days before communion. The calendar of the church left surprisingly few nights when intimacy was officially approved. Yet life was not lived according to rules alone. Couples navigated the balance between expectation and reality, finding their own rhythm in the spaces left by law, and custom legal records show us glimpses of this hidden world. In some cases, couples were accused of indecency for being found together in barns, behind ovens, or in the open fields. These accusations reveal less about scandal and more about the sheer lack of private space. If the house was too crowded, the couple stepped outside. The barn became a bedroom, the field, a sanctuary. Risk of discovery was always present, but so too was the need for closeness. In the crowded homes of the poor, even children grew up aware of their parents' intimacy. They might not have understood it fully, but they sensed it, overheard it, or simply knew that life carried on in the shadows of the night. In time, they too would marry and face the same challenges, continuing the cycle of crowded beds and whispered tenderness. Among the wealthy, things looked slightly different. Nobles, merchants, and landowners had chambers, rooms with doors and locks. A solar, an upper room in a manor house, gave a family some degree of privacy. Here, intimacy had more freedom. Yet even in castles, gossip still travelled. Servants slept nearby, attendants were ever present, and walls were thin. Privacy was better, but never perfect. It is easy to imagine that medieval people were less romantic because of these conditions. But romance existed, even thrived, though expressed differently. Love was not about roses or candlelight dinners, but about surviving together in hard conditions. It was about small acts, sharing warmth beneath a rough blanket, defending each other before the village, creating laughter in a life that left little space for joy. A wedding night, in this world, rarely meant solitude. It meant the continuation of ordinary life in extraordinary closeness. It meant that intimacy was no longer secret, but accepted, observed, even celebrated by the community. Yet within that communal gaze, couples still managed to make intimacy their own. Think again of that smoky room, the fire dim, the straw rustling as people shift in their sleep. Somewhere in that darkness, a husband reaches for his wife. She turns toward him, her breath warm on his cheek. Around them, the family sleeps. The goat shifts near the hearth. The night wind whistles through the roof hole. But for a few moments, the crowded world fades. They are no longer 10 people in one room. They are two, finding each other in silence. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not about privacy. It was about endurance. It was about finding love in the narrow spaces left by duty, poverty, and watchful eyes. It was about creating intimacy, not in secret chambers, but in crowded homes. And so, when we look back, we see not only the lack of comfort, but also the strength of love that refused to vanish. Couples did not wait for solitude. They made it, even when the world gave them no space at all. The night watchers. Night in a medieval village was never fully silent. The houses were crowded, the streets narrow, and the air thick with the smell of wood smoke, animals, and damp earth. When the sun set, most people stayed inside, gathered around, the fading glow of the hearth. Yet even as families lay down to sleep, someone was always awake. Someone always listened. Someone always watched. Imagine lying on a straw mattress, your children pressed against you, your spouse curled nearby. You try to drift into sleep, but every sound is magnified. A cough in the corner, the creak of wood, the soft bleating of the goat tied near the fire, the shuffle of someone shifting their blanket. You cannot escape the presence of others. Sleep comes slowly, if at all. The medieval night was filled with watchers. Some were accidental, awake because they could not sleep. Some were intentional, appointed to guard. In towns, there were watchmen who patrolled the streets, calling out the hours and listening for signs of fire or crime. In villages, there were neighbors who stayed alert, checking that barns were secure and that wolves were not circling the sheepfold. Inside houses, watchers were unappointed but inevitable. A child stirred, a grandmother snored, a servant lay, awake on her pallet. Even if intimacy was sought in the darkness, it was almost always witnessed in some way. For couples, this meant that love unfolded under the ears and eyes of others. There were no locked doors to shut out the world. Instead, there were blankets pulled higher, whispers kept to a minimum, and movements made cautiously. To be married was to accept that privacy was a luxury rarely afforded. The watchers outside, in the streets, also shaped intimacy. Curfews were common in medieval towns. Bells rang at dusk, signaling the closing of gates and the extinguishing of fires. Anyone caught wandering after curfew risked suspicion. Lovers who tried to meet in secret had to move carefully, hiding in shadows, hoping not to be spotted by the town guard. Court records show how often they failed. Lovers were caught in doorways, in gardens, even behind churches. The night belonged not only to the lovers but to the watchers. Inside homes, the watchers were more personal. A mother-in-law might hear the sounds of a couple behind a thin partition and shake her head in disapproval. A child might wake and, half asleep, remember what they heard for years afterward. A servant might gossip in the morning about what had been overheard. The bed was never truly private. This constant presence of watchers influenced how intimacy was expressed. It became quieter, gentler, and often disguised as sleep. Couples learned to move with subtlety, to murmur softly, to turn their backs against the eyes of the room. The blanket became a shield, the straw beneath them a muffler. Intimacy became an art of concealment, an act carried out with careful timing and hushed breath. Yet watchers did more than limit. They also confirmed. In a strange way, intimacy was validated by its witnesses. When a marriage was consummated, when children were born, the community knew. The watchers ensured that bonds were not only private emotions, but public facts. A couple's closeness was part of the village's story, part of what sustained the rhythm of life. Of course, not all watchers were welcome. Jealous neighbors, suspicious priests, or even nosy relatives might intrude on moments meant for two. Records from church courts reveal countless testimonies from people who claimed to have seen or heard others in compromising situations. It was not unusual for a case of adultery to be built on the whispers of those who had been awake at the wrong hour. In this sense, the medieval night was both a cover and a trap. Think again of lying in that smoky room. You pull your spouse close. You hear your father's breathing in the corner, steady and deep. You hear the child stir, then settle again. You hear the goat gnawing at its rope. You wonder if the servant is still awake, if she notices the rustle of your blanket. You whisper, anyway, because love cannot always wait. You whisper even though you know you are not alone. The watchers were everywhere, yet intimacy survived. It survived not because the conditions were ideal, but because people are resilient. They found ways to be close even when every sound could be overheard, even when every shadow could hide someone's eyes. Love did not disappear in the face of watchers. It adapted. Night itself was split into two halves, according to medieval custom. The first sleep stretched from dusk until around midnight. Then people often woke, prayed, talked quietly, or tended small chores before returning to their second sleep until dawn. These waking intervals created moments of opportunity. Couples might use the break between sleeps for conversation, affection, or intimacy. But the watchers were still there, stirring in the dark, listening. Sometimes, watchers were even invoked on purpose. Parents might listen for signs that their married children were beginning to build a family. Lords and ladies sometimes kept attendance, near to observe whether a marriage was properly consummated. In certain royal unions, witnesses were practically part of the ritual. For ordinary folk, the presence was less formal, but no less real. It is easy to imagine this world as suffocating. Yet for medieval people, it was simply the way life was lived. Privacy was not expected, so it was not mourned. Intimacy did not depend on solitude. It depended on the ability to connect, even under watchful eyes. Perhaps this is the lesson of the night watchers. They remind us that love is not fragile. It can grow in the most crowded rooms, in the most public spaces, even when silence is broken by coughs and whispers. The watchers may have limited what was possible, but they could not extinguish what was necessary. And so, the medieval night was never empty. It was full of sounds, full of presences, full of witnesses. But within it, couples still carved out moments of closeness, building their marriages in the shadows, making love into an act that was as much about endurance as desire. The watchers might hear, they might see, they might gossip, yet in the end, they could not take away the small, fierce privacy that two people created in the dark, when the rest of the world blurred into background noise. When walls had ears, picture the walls of a medieval house, thin wattle and daub, sometimes little more than sticks packed with mud. A sound on one side was easily heard on the other, a sneeze, a laugh, even the creak of a bed. Privacy was not built into the very architecture. Homes were designed for survival, not seclusion inside. There might be 2 rooms at most. One large space for living, cooking, eating, and sleeping, and sometimes a smaller chamber for the head of the household. Even then, the private room was rarely private. Servants came and went. Children wandered in. Neighbors borrowed salt or bread without hesitation. Doors were rarely locked, and shutters rattled in the wind. To live in such a place was to live exposed. Now imagine intimacy in such a house. A couple tried to whisper. They shifted on the straw. The small noises carried through the walls and into the ears of others. A neighbor sharpening a tool outside might overhear. A mother-in-law sewing by the fire might glance up knowingly. A child pretending to be asleep might remember more than they should. When walls had ears, discretion became essential. Couples learned to mask sounds. They timed their closeness for moments when the house was full of other noises. When the dog barked, when the wind howled, when pots clattered. A storm could be a blessing, covering the rustle of blankets and muffled sighs. This constant lack of privacy shaped how love and marriage worked. It was not about grand gestures hidden away. It was about small signals given in the open. A hand brushing against another at the table. A glance exchanged across the room. A joke told in a way that only one person fully understood. Love had to survive in fragments, woven into the fabric of communal life. Even among the wealthy, the walls did little to contain. Stone castles echoed with footsteps and chatter. Servants slept in corners, in hallways, even at the foot of their lord's bed. Letters passed between lovers risked being intercepted by chambermaids or clerks. Curtains provided the illusion of privacy, but not the reality. A noblewoman might lower a tapestry to hide a meeting, but the sound of laughter or murmuring voices often slipped through. Church authorities knew this, and they made use of it. Many trials for adultery or fornication relied on witnesses. "I heard them through the wall," one neighbor might swear. "I saw shadows moving under the window," another claimed. The architecture itself became evidence. When the walls betrayed secrets, the law followed. But for the ordinary couple, the awareness of listening ears rarely stopped affection. They simply adjusted. Some used coded speech, phrases that meant one thing to outsiders and another to the beloved. Others invented rituals, like placing shoes side by the hearth, to signal readiness. Some couples even laughed about it, turning the lack of privacy into a kind of game, daring each other to be quiet while everyone else snored nearby. For children, growing up in such houses meant that intimacy was not hidden, only unspoken. They heard things, saw glimpses, and learned early about the rhythms of adult life. This does not mean it was celebrated openly, but it was not completely erased either. The walls let secrets leak, and the young absorbed them. The walls also shaped trust. In a village where everyone overheard everyone else, relationships depended on discretion. A servant who kept her master's secrets was valued. A neighbor who repeated what they heard might become an enemy. Gossip was as powerful as money, and walls that carried voices made gossip spread all the faster, yet love still flourished. Couples carved intimacy into the noisy, crowded life around them. They whispered anyway. They touched hands when they could. They made use of shadows and corners, of storms and festivals, of moments when the watchers were distracted. Love did not require perfect silence, only persistence. Think again of lying in that house, the walls thin, the sounds carrying. Your spouse shifts closer. You hear laughter outside, and it covers your whispered words. You know the child is pretending to sleep, but you continue anyway, because the world has always been this way. The walls may have ears, but your heart still insists. The watchful eyes of the village imagine stepping outside in a medieval village. The sun is low, the smoke from cooking fires rises into the air, and the smell of bread, manure, and damp earth mixes all around you. Life here is not private, not hidden. Everyone knows everyone else. Faces are familiar, footsteps recognizable, voices impossible to mistake. The idea of anonymity did not exist. If you walked to the well, a neighbor saw you. If you spoke to someone at the market, others overheard. If you lingered too long near the miller's daughter, tongues began to wag. The eyes of the village were always open. This mattered deeply for love and intimacy. Courtship was not secret romance by candlelight. It was watched, measured, and often judged by others. A man speaking too warmly with a young woman might find himself teased. A woman laughing too loudly with a visitor could spark suspicion. Gossip traveled faster than carts on the road. Young people learned to maneuver under this constant surveillance. They developed little tricks. Some pretended to meet by chance, at the well, on the path to church, or while gathering firewood. Others used festivals as cover. During the harvest feast, with everyone drinking ale and dancing, a stolen kiss could hide in plain sight. But secrecy was never perfect. Villages thrived on stories. If one person noticed, soon the whole community whispered. A neighbor might see a man leaving a cottage too early in the morning. Another might notice a girl's hair untidy after evening prayers. The smallest detail could become a tale retold again and again. For married couples, this watchfulness cut both ways. On one hand, it offered protection. If a husband mistreated his wife, neighbors might notice the bruises or the shouts. If a wife was abandoned, the village remembered and sometimes held the husband to account. Community kept order, not always kindly, but firmly. On the other hand, the same eyes restricted freedom. A couple could rarely escape notice. If they argued, others knew. If they reconciled tenderly, others saw. Intimacy was not only between two people, but carried out before the quiet judgment of many. The church encouraged this watchfulness. Priests reminded villagers that sin spread when ignored. Husbands and wives were urged to correct each other. Neighbors were urged to report misconduct. The village became both home and courtroom. Privacy was a fragile illusion, constantly broken by watchful eyes, yet love still adapted. Lovers carved out spaces within the gaze of others. They wrote small notes scratched on wood or parchment. They met in barns, pretending to tend animals. They used siblings or friends as cover, meeting in groups so attention was diverted. Some grew skilled at disguising affection as ordinary behavior, an offer to help carry a bucket, a casual touch while handing bread, a glance across the church nave. Still, mistakes happened. A careless smile seen by the wrong person could ruin reputations. A slip of the tongue could betray a secret. In the village, memory was long and forgiveness slow. Scandal clung like smoke to a roof beam, hard to shake away. The constant gaze also meant that marriages were never only private unions. They were public matters. The whole community celebrated weddings, and the whole community noticed if a marriage soured. Even the marriage bed was thought of as a social duty. A couple's intimacy was not just personal, it was tied to inheritance, property, and family honor. The village watched, waiting for signs of children, waiting for heirs. Think of how that must have felt, to love in a place where every gesture was noticed, to live knowing your neighbors saw when you laughed too much, when you frowned too often, when you lingered in the doorway at night. Imagine carrying desire quietly, carefully, in a world where secrets had no shelter. And yet, within this pressure, real tenderness bloomed. Couples whispered to each other in the noise of markets. They brushed fingers as they passed food across a table. They turned daily chores into little rituals of closeness. Love became a skill of subtlety, an art of surviving under watchful eyes. The village, with all its gazes, was both prison and stage. You could not escape its attention, but you could learn to move gracefully within it. Some even used it to their advantage, letting rumors of affection pave the way to marriage, turning whispers into official arrangements. Others resisted, clinging to forbidden loves despite the stares, finding stolen moments behind barns or hedges. The eyes of the village never closed, but hearts did not stop seeking each other. In the tension between surveillance and secrecy, medieval love unfolded, persistent, stubborn, and very human. The bed was never yours. Alone, close your eyes for a moment and picture a medieval bed. Not the kind of wide, soft mattress you know today, but a wooden frame stuffed with straw, maybe a blanket or two, maybe none at all. The sheets, if they existed, were rough and scratchy, often crawling with lice. A bed was not always private, and more often than not, it was shared in a poor household. One bed could hold an entire family. Parents, children, even grandparents sometimes lay side by side, shoulder to shoulder, feet tangled together for warmth. In winter, when icy winds slipped through the cracks in the walls, crowding into the bed was not optional. It was survival. The heat of bodies was the only central heating peasants knew. That meant intimacy between husband and wife rarely happened alone. A child might be dozing nearby. An elderly relative might shift on the straw. Even servants or apprentices sometimes shared the same space. The bed was not just a place for lovers. It was a communal piece of furniture, a stage for sleeping, talking, nursing, and living. Privacy was so rare that many couples learned to be quiet, to communicate in whispers, to keep movements subtle. Imagine the tension of wanting to be close to someone while a pair of small ears listened in the dark, while a cough broke the silence, while you were aware that every sound carried in the cramped room. The wealthy fared only slightly better. Yes, they had larger beds, hung with curtains, raised high above the floor. But even noble beds were rarely private. Servants slept at the foot, ladies in waiting dozed nearby, and pages often curled up in corners. Curtains offered the illusion of secrecy, but whispers leaked through cloth, and the shuffle of movement was never truly hidden. For nobles, intimacy was also complicated by politics. Marriage was a contract, a binding of families, wealth, and power. A husband and wife might not even like each other. They were expected to produce heirs regardless of affection, and because inheritance was everything, others had a vested interest in what happened in the bed. Servants might be asked to check sheets for proof of consummation after a wedding night. Priests reminded couples that intimacy was both duty and sacred act meant for procreation, not pleasure. In some regions, even kings had to demonstrate their ability to perform, their sheets inspected like evidence in a trial. Imagine how that must have felt, to have your most private moment treated like public proof. For ordinary people, the scrutiny was quieter, but still real. A village noticed if a wife did not become pregnant after years of marriage. Whispers began. Questions were raised. Was the husband weak? Was the wife barren? Sometimes, blame turned cruel, with accusations of witchcraft or curses. The pressure on couples to prove their fertility was immense, and the bed was where that pressure became most real. But let's return to that dark, crowded room of the peasant's cottage. Imagine the fire dying low in the hearth, 10 people sleeping on piles of straw, the sound of breathing all around you. Somewhere in the night, a husband shifts closer to his wife. He tries to be silent, careful, but the floor creaks, the straw rustles. Perhaps no one stirs, or perhaps a child stares with wide eyes in the dark, silently aware of what adults do. There was embarrassment, yes, but also acceptance. This was simply life. People grew up surrounded by others, sharing space, sharing warmth. Intimacy was less about perfect privacy and more about making do, carving out little corners of closeness, even when the world pressed in. Over time, couples grew inventive. They might slip away to barns or stables, pretending to check on animals. They might linger in fields after work, hidden by hedges or tall grass. Privacy was something you borrowed for a moment, never something you owned, and often it was stolen from the edges of daily tasks, disguised as ordinary chores. Think, too, of how different that made intimacy feel. Today, privacy is expected. A locked door, a quiet bedroom, freedom from intrusion. In the medieval world, that luxury barely existed. The bed was not yours alone. It belonged to your family, your servants, even your neighbors in some ways. Every touch carried the risk of being overheard, every sigh the chance of being noticed. And yet, despite the lack of privacy, affection survived. Couples whispered to each other in the dark. They found comfort in small touches, in shared blankets, in secret signals. Sometimes, the lack of space made intimacy more precious. Every chance to be alone was rare, and rarity sharpened desire. A stolen moment became unforgettable because it was so hard to find. So when we imagine the medieval bed, we must let go of modern ideas of solitude and romance. It was crowded, noisy, and watched. It was never truly yours. But within those constraints, people still loved, still reached for each other in the night, still made space for closeness in a world that never stopped pressing in. The bed was never just a bed. It was a family, a household, a duty, and sometimes, despite everything, a place where love managed to bloom in whispers and shadows. The church watched your bedroom. 2. If you thought the only people watching you in the medieval bed were family and servants, think again. The church had its eyes on you too. Not literally, of course, but in rules, sermons, and confessions. For centuries, priests and bishops believed that the bedroom was not just a private place for love, but a battlefield for the soul. The church did not simply encourage marriage, it shaped marriage. It told people when they could marry, who they could marry, and what they were allowed to do after the vows were spoken. And that meant the bed was never free from its gaze. Let's start with something strange to modern ears. There were calendars of forbidden days. Whole chunks of the year when couples were told they must abstain. Advent, Lent, Easter week, holy feast days, even Sundays were often off limits. Some years, that added up to nearly half the calendar. Imagine being newly married, eager for closeness, and being told again and again, tonight is forbidden. Why such strict rules? Because the church believed intimacy was holy, but dangerous. It was meant for procreation, not for pleasure. Too much passion, too much enjoyment, was seen as sinful. The goal was to bring new life into the world, not to delight in desire. If a couple forgot that, priests warned, their souls could be in jeopardy, and priests were not shy about details. Medieval penitentials, those little handbooks for confessors, spelled out lists of forbidden acts in astonishing precision. They asked questions that sound intrusive even today. How often? In what position? With what intention? The very mechanics of intimacy were put under inspection. Some acts were punished with fasting, others with years of penance. To stray too far from approved behavior was to risk eternal damnation. For the average villager, these rules were terrifying, but also confusing. Many could not read. Many did not understand the Latin sermons. What they heard were fragments, warnings passed from mouth to mouth, whispers of sin, of hellfire, of what not to do in bed. This meant that the act most private to a couple was also haunted by fear. Fear of doing it wrong, fear of being too eager, fear of God's disapproval. Imagine lying in bed, wanting to be close, and remembering the priest's stern words, pleasure is temptation, passion is sin. Imagine the guilt woven into the straw mattress, the blanket heavy not just with warmth but with shame. Yet, of course, people were people. They laughed, they touched, they broke rules. And the church knew it. Confession became the place where private life spilled out. Husbands and wives admitted their desires, sometimes shamefaced, sometimes desperate for reassurance. The priest listened, judged, and prescribed penance. In this way, even the secrets of the bed became known to others. It went further. In some communities, if a marriage was troubled, neighbors or family might involve the church. Priests questioned couples about their nights. Was the marriage consummated? Was the wife resisting her duty? Was the husband too weak? The language of faith became entangled with the most personal details of human life. And when it came to nobles and royalty, the scrutiny was even harsher. Kings had to prove they could produce heirs. Queens were watched to ensure their wombs were fruitful. Papal dispensations were needed for marriages too close in blood. Beds in palaces were not private, sanctuaries but political instruments. A royal couple's success or failure in bed could determine wars, treaties, or the future of entire kingdoms, but step back into the ordinary cottage. A peasant couple, lying close in the dark, aware that the priest will ask questions in confession, aware that God is said to watch even in the night. They move slowly, quietly, carrying both desire and dread. They are not kings, yet their bed is also shaped by rules beyond their control. And here lies the strange truth. The church's grip on the bedroom was both restrictive and protective. On the one hand, it narrowed the purpose of intimacy, reducing it to procreation, condemning pleasure as dangerous. On the other hand, it gave women some power. A wife could claim religious grounds to refuse her husband during forbidden times. She could say, "Today is a feast day," or "This week is Lent," and he was expected to obey. The church's rules, though, suffocating, sometimes gave women leverage they otherwise lacked. This constant dance between desire and prohibition shaped medieval love. Couples lived with the knowledge that their bed was never entirely their own. Even if the room was silent, even if family was asleep, even if they were finally alone, the shadow of the church lingered, whispering what was permitted and what was not. Over time, though, people found ways to bend the rules. Forbidden days were ignored in practice. Confessions left things unsaid. Priests turned blind eyes to what they suspected but could not prove. The human heart, after all, was not so easily contained. And so, medieval beds were spaces of tension. Flesh and faith wrestled in the dark. Couples loved each other, not just against the weight of poverty or the eyes of family, but against centuries of doctrine that sought to tame passion. Think of that for a moment. Think of lying in a cold cottage, wrapped in straw, holding your beloved, close, knowing the church says tonight is forbidden. Would you obey, or would you defy? That was the nightly question, and perhaps that is why intimacy in the medieval world carried such power. It was never casual. It was never free of meaning. It was burdened with rules, with sin, with politics, with shame. But because of all that, every act of closeness was also an act of courage, of rebellion, or of faith itself. The church watched, yes, but love still found its way into the cracks. And in those whispered, half-forbidden moments, couples carved out something deeply human, something no law or sermon could fully take away. When the village listened in privacy, as we imagine it today, did not really exist in the medieval village. A peasant's home was not a sealed-off sanctuary. It was a single smoky room with thin walls of wattle and daub, a floor of packed earth, and a roof of thatch. Sound carried easily. Doors were not locked. They were hardly more than wooden planks. Neighbors came and went. Families shared the same small space, and the community was never far away. That meant your most private moments were often anything but private. Intimacy, arguments, reconciliations, even whispers between lovers could be overheard. And when people overheard, they talked. Gossip was not just entertainment, it was part of the fabric of social control. Let's picture it. A husband and wife lie close on their straw bed, the fire low, the children half asleep. A creak of the bed, a hushed murmur, a stifled laugh. The sound slips through the thin walls. A neighbor, fetching water in the night, pauses. She smiles, maybe shakes her head. The next morning, at the well, she tells another woman what she heard. And so the story spreads. The medieval village thrived on stories. Gossip was how reputations were made and unmade. To be called a faithful wife, a virile husband, a modest daughter, was to be respected. To be whispered about, accused of lust, of coldness, or of straying, was to carry a shadow wherever you went, and people listened very carefully. Weddings were communal, consummation often discussed openly, and if a couple seemed unhappy, the village would know. Sometimes neighbors even had the role of witnesses. Believe it or not, in some traditions, after the wedding, family and friends escorted the couple to their bedchamber. They might wait outside, listening for signs that the marriage was properly sealed. The act that we think of as private was, in those moments, a public concern. Why such intrusion? Because marriage was not only about love, it was about property, inheritance, alliances, and legitimacy. A union had to be fruitful. If it was not, questions arose. Was the husband weak? Was the wife barren? Was someone failing in their duty? And these questions were not whispered only in church. They were whispered in taverns, fields, and marketplaces. This constant scrutiny shaped how couples behaved. A wife who resisted intimacy too often might be branded stubborn or cold. A husband who failed in bed might be mocked as unmanly. Gossip could sting like a wound. It could also protect. A woman who was mistreated might find sympathy if her neighbors spread the tale, shaming her husband into better behavior. In this way, the community became a kind of second bedfellow, always present, always judging, and the stories were not only about married couples. Young lovers, too, were watched. A girl seen walking too late with a boy risked her reputation. A glance, a touch, even standing too close could spark talk. Villagers had sharp eyes and sharper tongues. They noticed if two people exchanged too many smiles, or if a young man lingered outside a cottage too often. In small communities, nothing stayed secret for long. This was not mere curiosity. It was survival. In a world where lineage mattered, where property passed from father to son, and where illegitimacy could destroy a family's future, the village had a vested interest in everyone's behavior. To keep order, people policed each other. Gossip became both weapon and shield. But imagine how it felt. Imagine lying beside your spouse, knowing that the faintest sound could feed the next day's chatter. Imagine meeting your lover under the moonlight, aware that any witness could ruin your chances of marriage. Imagine the pressure, the weight of community ears always listening. It was not only ears. Sometimes the surveillance was direct. Parents arranged marriages and watched their daughters closely, guarding their virtue like treasure. Servants were expected to report misbehavior in the household. Even inns and taverns had watchful eyes. A tryst was rarely hidden for long, and yet people still found ways to carve out moments of privacy. Lovers met in barns, by rivers, in fields, at dusk. Husbands and wives whispered in the night, their words muffled by blankets. Couples learned to be subtle, to hide their passion under the cover of routine. In this sense, love was always a small act of defiance against the gaze of the village. Interestingly, gossip was not always cruel. Sometimes it was playful. A newlywed couple might be teased for their long nights together. A man with too many. Children might be winked at knowingly. The line between ridicule and admiration was thin. What mattered was balance. To be neither too cold nor too lustful. To walk the narrow path of virtue as defined by neighbors. Still, the consequences of gossip could be harsh. A woman accused of infidelity could be shamed publicly, even dragged, before the local court. A man mocked as impotent could lose standing among his peers. And since medieval law often relied on witness testimony, what people said, those murmurs and tales, carried real power. We moderns might think of intimacy as a bond between two people, sealed away from the world. But for medieval villagers, it was never just that. It was part of a larger social script, a drama in which everyone played a role, whether as actors or as audience. The bed was a stage, the walls thin curtains, and the village always watching from the shadows. So when we think of medieval love, we must imagine it not as private candlelit moments, but as whispers carried on the wind, footsteps heard through thin walls, rumors spreading with the morning bread. The community was always present, always listening, always shaping what was allowed and what was condemned. And yet, in spite of the gossip, in spite of the watchful eyes, love survived. Couples laughed, whispered, found joy in stolen moments. They knew they were being watched, but still they reached for each other in the dark. Perhaps that is the most human truth of all, that even in a world without privacy, people still carved out space for tenderness, for desire, for connection. The law of the bedchamber in medieval Europe. Intimacy was never only personal. It was bound tightly to law, faith, and custom. What a couple did or did not do in their bed could end up before judges, priests, or even kings. To us, it might sound strange that courts could rule on such private matters, but in the Middle Ages, the line between public and private life was faint, almost invisible. The bedroom was not just a place of rest, it was a legal stage where reputation, inheritance, and honor could rise or fall. Let us begin with adultery, a crime viewed not only as sin but also as betrayal of property and bloodline. If a married woman was suspected of straying, the matter did not stay behind closed doors. Her husband might take her before the local court, or the village might pressure for action. The church courts often handled these cases, since adultery was seen as a violation of marriage vows, and marriage was under the church's authority. But how could such a private act be proven? Often, it came down to witness testimony and rumor. Neighbors who claimed to have seen a man slipping into a cottage, servants who reported hearing suspicious noises, or townsfolk who noticed unusual closeness between two people. All could be called to testify. Circumstantial evidence carried great weight. A single kiss, if witnessed, could destroy a woman's reputation. Punishments varied. A noblewoman might be locked away or divorced, while a peasant wife might face public shaming. In some towns, women, caught in adultery, were paraded through the streets, their hair cut, their clothes torn, a spectacle meant to humiliate. Men, too, could face penalties, though often less severe. A husband's honor was considered more valuable than a wife's, and protecting the legitimacy of children was seen as essential to the order of society. There were, however, cases where women turned the law to their advantage. Some wives accused their husbands of impotence, seeking annulment on the grounds that the marriage had not been consummated. This led to one of the most curious practices in medieval law, the impotence trial. Imagine it. A man, accused of failing in his marital duty, had to prove before a court that he was capable of consummation. Sometimes this meant a physical examination by physicians or midwives. In rare cases, it even meant public tests of virility, though these were often more symbolic than literal. The humiliation was profound. To be declared impotent was to lose honor, status, and the very identity of manhood. For the wife, however, it opened the possibility of freedom, and remarriage annulments were not only about impotence. They could also be granted if the marriage had never been consummated for other reasons. If a husband and wife swore they had not shared a bed, the church might dissolve the union. Yet this required honesty. And honesty was complicated when property, dowries, and alliances were at stake. Some couples lied to escape unhappy matches, others lied to protect family honor. Judges were left to untangle knots of testimony, rumor, and oath. The church itself worried deeply about these matters. For priests and theologians, marriage was not only companionship, it was a sacrament. A marriage without consummation was like a cup without wine, incomplete and invalid. At the same time, illicit passion threatened the sanctity of the sacrament. This tension produced endless debates. Was it worse to have too much desire or too little? Could a marriage survive without children? Was pleasure sinful, or was it acceptable if directed toward reproduction? Laws around intimacy were often shaped by these debates. For instance, adultery was judged more harshly for women than men, since a woman's infidelity could bring illegitimate heirs. A man's infidelity, though frowned upon, did not endanger lineage in the same way. Here we see how power, gender, and property wove themselves into the fabric of intimacy. Yet, for all the severity, there were surprising moments of leniency. Some judges looked the other way if the accused were of high status. Others accepted settlements or fines instead of harsher penalties. And in small villages, justice was often handled informally, with shaming rituals or forced reconciliations. A husband and wife might be ordered to live together again, to forgive, and to perform their duties properly, as if love could be commanded by decree. The presence of law in the bedroom shaped how people spoke about intimacy. Couples who quarreled risked public exposure. Servants who overheard too much might become witnesses. A careless act of affection outside the home could become evidence. This constant awareness turned private life into something staged, cautious, carefully guarded, and yet people were resourceful. Lovers found ways to meet in secret, using codes, letters, or songs. Husbands and wives learned to mask their true feelings in court, swearing what was necessary to protect themselves. The law could pry into their sheets, but it could not fully command the heart. One of the most remarkable aspects of medieval law was its reliance on community testimony. Courts did not have forensic evidence, nor could they rely on hidden documents. They relied on people, on what neighbors saw and heard. This meant that gossip and law blurred together. A whispered suspicion could harden into legal proof. A rumor could ruin a marriage as surely as an affair itself. In this sense, the medieval courtroom was not only a place of judgment, but also a mirror of the village. It reflected the fears, prejudices, and desires of the community. The law enforced what people already believed, that intimacy belonged not only to the couple, but to the family, the neighbors, and the church. For those who lived it, the experience must have been heavy. To love, to desire, to fail in the bedchamber was not only personal, it was a risk to honor and livelihood. And yet, despite all the rules, despite all the punishments, intimacy persisted. Couples still quarreled and reconciled, still strayed and forgave, still found ways to be together in the face of judgment. Perhaps that is the paradox of the medieval world. The law tried to control desire, to measure it, to bind it with rules. But desire slipped through the cracks, as it always does. In the end, even the most watchful priest or the sternest judge could not stop two people from reaching for each other in the dark. The poetry of desire. When we think of the Middle Ages, it is easy to picture only hardship, plagues, famine, wars, and strict rules. Yet in the midst of all this, another world blossomed, one woven not from law or fear, but from music and poetry. This was the world of courtly love, a dreamlike vision of romance that gave shape to longings often stifled in daily life. If the law treated intimacy as duty, and the church treated it as sin, poets treated it as beauty. Courtly love was not born in the silence of monasteries, nor in the smoky halls of peasants. It first took shape in the courts of southern France during the 11th and 12th centuries. Here, noble lords and ladies, far from the battlefield, gathered to enjoy music, games, and storytelling. Troubadours, wandering poet-musicians, arrived with lutes in hand, singing verses that celebrated longing, devotion, and the sweet pain of desire. These songs told of knights who adored noble ladies, of men who bowed to women with loyalty that bordered on worship. Often, the love described was impossible. The lady was married, higher in rank, or simply unreachable. The knight's task was not to possess her, but to honor her, to suffer nobly for her beauty, and to find joy in service. It was love reimagined, as a kind of spiritual exercise, pure yet burning, distant yet consuming. Why did this vision take hold? In part, because it offered something the real world rarely allowed: romance for its own sake. Most marriages among the nobility were arranged for property and alliance. Personal choice mattered little, and affection often came after duty if it came at all. Courtly love poetry gave men and women permission to imagine something different. A love chosen freely, cherished secretly, celebrated in words rather than contracts. The language of these poems was rich with symbolism. The lady was compared to the sun, the morning star, the rose in bloom. The knight was the humble servant, the pilgrim, the wounded bird. Desire was both joyful and painful, a sweet suffering that ennobled the lover. Even distance was a blessing, for it kept love pure, unsullied by the physical realities of marriage or daily life. And yet, these songs were not entirely fantasy. They were performed before real men and women, some of whom may have recognized themselves in the verses. A knight might truly pine for a lady he could not have. A lady might enjoy the admiration, even if it never turned to action. In this way, poetry became both a mask and a mirror, hiding true feelings while revealing them in safe disguise. As the tradition spread across Europe, it took many forms. In France, troubadours sang in Occitan, the soft lyrical language of the south. In Germany, minnesingers picked up the theme, crafting verses of devotion in the courts along the Rhine. In Italy, poets like Dante wove visions of heavenly love, where the beloved woman became a guide to divine truth. In England, too, echoes of courtly love appeared in romances and ballads, filling castles with tales of knights and maidens. But perhaps the most famous stories of courtly love are those of King Arthur's court. Tales of Sir Lancelot and Queen Guinevere, of Tristan and Isolde. These romances blended chivalry with forbidden desire, making the tension between duty and longing their central theme. Readers and listeners were drawn not only to the beauty of devotion, but also to the danger of breaking the rules. Love, in these stories, was thrilling precisely because it was fragile, forbidden, or doomed. How did ordinary people respond to this? While the full elegance of troubadour poetry belonged to the nobility, simpler songs and stories carried the same themes into villages and towns. Traveling performers known as jongleurs sang ballads that blended courtly ideals with humor and everyday details. A farmer's daughter might be praised as if she were a queen. A shepherd boy might dream of his beloved with the intensity of a knight. In this way, the high art of courts trickled down into folk culture, where it mingled with laughter, satire, and play. It is important to remember, though, that courtly love was not a law or a universal reality. It was a performance, a cultural game, a way to dress longing in fine words. For many men and women, daily life in marriage remained bound by duty, work, and survival. Yet the presence of these songs allowed space for imagination. They offered a world where love was not judged by neighbors, priests, or courts, but by the heart. Interestingly, the church both criticized and absorbed this movement. Some priests denounced troubadour songs as distractions, temptations that led to lust. Yet others found in the language of devotion a tool for religious expression. Mystical writers sometimes borrowed the imagery of courtly love to describe the soul's longing for God. The language of desire, once aimed at a lady, could be redirected toward the divine. This blending of sacred and secular shows how powerful the idea of love had become. It was not merely a private matter, but a cultural force, shaping art, music, and even faith. To hear a troubadour sing under the moonlight was not just to enjoy entertainment, it was to participate in a shared dream of beauty and longing that lifted people, if only for a moment, above the weight of daily struggle. Courtly love also changed the way people thought about women. In reality, women's lives were tightly controlled, their roles often limited. Yet in poetry, the lady was placed on a pedestal, honored and adored. She became a figure of power, holding sway over the knight who served her. Of course, this was often symbolic, not practical, but even as symbol, it shifted perception. It allowed men to imagine devotion, humility, and service to a woman as virtues rather than weaknesses. There is something calming in this, is there not? To imagine a world where even amid hardship and strict rules, people found ways to sing of love, to lift it into art. The very act of composing a love poem was itself a form of rebellion, a gentle refusal to let duty and law have the final word. It said that longing mattered, that beauty mattered, that the heart could dream even when reality was harsh. When we listen across centuries to these songs, we hear voices that are both distant and familiar. A knight declaring devotion to his lady is not so different from a modern song of love. A lady praised as a rose is not far from today's metaphors of beauty. The forms have changed, but the longing remains the same in the quiet of a medieval court. By candlelight or firelight, these songs must have carried more than words. They carried hope, memory, and secret sighs. They reminded listeners that love was not only about law or lineage, but also about the fragile stirrings of the human heart. So, while the courts ruled on adultery and priests debated sin, the poets sang. Their verses slipped past the walls of law and custom, planting seeds of beauty in a soil often hard and unforgiving. And in those moments, love became not a duty, not a crime, but a song, soft, fleeting, eternal. Flirting in the festival crowd life in the Middle Ages was often marked by routine. Work in the fields, prayers in the church, duties in the household, and the endless rhythm of survival left little room for pleasure. Yet, scattered throughout the year came moments that lifted people out of this rhythm. Festivals, feasts, and holidays. These were times of colour, sound, and movement, times when the rules relaxed, and the air itself seemed to sparkle with possibilities. Imagine a village square at midsummer. Bonfires crackle as dusk fades. Young men and women gather, their faces lit by firelight. Music rises, pipes, drums, fiddles, and with it, laughter. Couples circle the flames in dance, hands brushing, eyes meeting. Children chase each other in the shadows. Elders watch with knowing smiles, and for a few hours, the whole community breathes more freely. For many medieval people, festivals were the one chance in the year to explore feelings that could not be spoken at home or church. The daily life of peasants was harsh and disciplined, but during Carnival, May Day, or harvest feasts, roles could blur. A servant might dance with a lord's daughter, if only for a moment. A married woman might enjoy the admiration of men outside, her family. A shy young man could test his courage by offering a flower, a ribbon, or even just a smile. The dances themselves were carefully designed to create opportunities for closeness without scandal. In circle dances, hands linked as men and women turned together, sometimes switching partners in playful rhythm. In line dances, couples faced one another, stepping forward and back in time with the music. These patterns allowed touches, glances, and small conversations to pass unnoticed. It was flirting disguised as ritual, a socially safe way to explore connection, of course. Not everyone approved. Preachers often railed against dancing, calling it a gateway to sin. They complained that young people used festivals as excuses to meet in secret, to whisper promises, or even to slip into the woods after the fires burned low. And they were not entirely wrong. Folk songs and poems from the time are full of tales of lovers meeting during May Day games or harvest feasts. The festival, with its laughter and drink, softened the watchful eyes of parents and priests. One of the most famous traditions was the maypole dance. In villages across Europe, a tall pole was raised, decorated with flowers, ribbons, and greenery. Dancers wove around it, intertwining ribbons in bright patterns. The pole itself, standing tall and crowned with blossoms, carried deep symbolism of life, fertility, and renewal. For young people, dancing around it was both joyful and suggestive, a celebration of the body as much as the season carnival too offered license. Held before the fasting of Lent, it was a time when the world seemed turned upside down. People wore masks, dressed as animals, or swapped clothes with the opposite sex. Nobles mocked peasants, peasants mocked nobles, and for a short while, all barriers seemed to fall. In this topsy-turvy world, hidden feelings could be expressed under cover of disguise. A masked lover could speak boldly without fear of recognition, at least until the masks were removed. Food and drink played their part. As well, feasts were filled with meat, bread, ale, and wine, luxuries that many peasants rarely tasted. The warmth of drink loosened tongues, making conversations flow more easily. Stories, songs, and jokes spread from table to table. In such moments, even the shyest could find words they might never dare to say in daylight. It was not only the young who joined in. Festivals were communal, bringing together people of all ages. Married couples might rediscover affection in the dance. Parents might exchange glances while their children played, and widows or widowers might find companions. The sense of togetherness created by shared celebration blurred lines, reminding everyone that life was not only about work and duty, but also about joy. And yet, as always, rules lingered in the background. A festival romance could be dangerous. If it crossed certain lines, A girl caught sneaking away with a man risked gossip that could stain her reputation. A married man seen too often with another woman might face ridicule, punishment, or worse. Even amid music and firelight, eyes were watching, tongues ready to whisper. The very freedom of the festival made it fragile, always balanced between delight and danger. Still, the appeal was irresistible. People needed these moments of release. They needed laughter after months of toil, music after weeks of silence, warmth after winters of hunger. And in the dance of festivals, they also found ways to express feelings that otherwise lay hidden. Flirting became not just a game, but a survival of the heart festivals were also tied to the cycles of nature, which deepened their connection to love and desire. Midsummer celebrated the longest day, when the sun's power promised growth and abundance. May Day welcomed fertility in both land and life. Harvest feasts gave thanks for food and hinted at the warmth of community needed to face the cold ahead. These were times when the human body and the earth itself were seen as partners, both full of cycles, both in need of care, both capable of renewal in towns and cities. Festivals were even grander. Parades filled the streets, guilds staged plays, and minstrels performed. Here too, love played its role. Plays often included comic scenes of young men chasing women, or clever girls outwitting foolish suitors. Audiences laughed, but they also recognized themselves in these exaggerated tales. Public laughter eased private anxieties, reminding people that desire was universal, part of the human story. Even the church, despite its warnings, often joined in. Many festivals were tied to saints' days or holy events, blending sacred and secular. Priests might bless the fields before a May Day feast, or lead processions that ended in dancing. The line between worship and celebration blurred, showing that love, longing, and laughter could not be kept apart from faith. And so, in the flicker of firelight, in the whirl of dance, in the laughter of crowded streets, medieval people found freedom. They could not always choose whom to marry, but they could choose whom to dance beside. They could not always speak their feelings, but they could sing, laugh, and glance in ways that carried meaning. Festivals were not escapes from reality, but brief remakings of it, where longing and joy were allowed to breathe. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it. The sound of pipes and drums, the swirl of skirts, the scent of roasted meat and fresh ale, the warmth of a hand brushing yours as you circle the maypole. For that instant, the whole world is lighter. The hard lines of duty soften, and the heart dares to hope. That was the gift of festivals. That was the poetry of the crowd. When love became a crime. Love in the Middle Ages was not always a sweet song or a dance around the maypole. It could also be dangerous. Behind the laughter of festivals and the secret glances of lovers lay a harsh truth. In a society built on reputation, obedience, and strict rules, love that crossed boundaries could become scandal, and scandal could bring punishment. Marriage was rarely about romance. It was an arrangement of property, dowry, and alliance. For nobles, it meant securing land and power. For peasants, it meant securing help in the fields, bread on the table, and survival through the seasons. Love was sometimes a happy accident within marriage, but just as often it was found outside it. And that was where trouble began. Adultery was one of the gravest sins in medieval society. For women especially, the price could be severe. A wife accused of unfaithfulness risked not only her honor, but also her life. In some regions, the punishment was death by burning or stoning, though more often it meant public humiliation, exile, or being locked away in a convent. Men too could be punished, but the weight of shame fell more heavily on women, whose bodies were seen as symbols of family honor. Yet accusations of adultery did not always come from truth. Gossip was enough to destroy reputations. A woman seen talking too often with a man who was not her husband could become the subject of whispers. Neighbors watched closely, and even innocent meetings could be twisted into scandal. In small villages, where everyone knew everyone, the walls of privacy were thin. A laugh, a glance, or a walk home in the dark might be enough to fuel suspicion. When punishment came, it was often public. Shame was a tool as powerful as chains. In towns, guilty lovers might be paraded through the streets wearing mocking signs or symbols. They could be forced to sit backward on a donkey, to wear ridiculous clothing, or to hold hands while the crowd jeered. The point was not only to punish the individuals, but to warn everyone else. Desire that disobeyed rules was dangerous. Other punishments were harsher still. In parts of Europe, there were laws against fornication, intimate relations outside marriage. A young couple caught too close might face fines, lashes, or time in the stocks. In Germany, records describe couples forced to walk through town in nothing but their underclothes, tied together for all to see. In England, church courts fined unmarried parents and sometimes ordered them to do penance barefoot before the congregation. But even these punishments could not erase desire. People found ways to meet in secret. They whispered at festivals, slipped into shadows after work, or met in barns, fields, and forests. The risk was part of the thrill, though the fear of discovery was always close. Songs from the time tell of lovers fleeing into the woods, where leaves and birds were their only witnesses. These songs capture both the joy and the danger, reminding us that love was not only a private feeling, but also a public gamble. The church kept a tight hold on these matters. Confession was one place where secrets spilled. Priests heard countless tales of forbidden love, though they rarely shared them. Instead, they ordered prayers, fasts, or pilgrimages as penance. A lover might walk barefoot to a shrine, or spend weeks reciting prayers, seeking forgiveness for a passion they could not resist. Yet many confessed again and again, showing that the heart did not always listen to rules. For nobles, the stakes were even higher. An adulterous affair could unravel alliances, spark feuds, or even start wars. Chronicles tell of queens accused of straying, their honor questioned in courts filled with enemies. Some faced trials by ordeal, where boiling water or red-hot iron would supposedly reveal the truth. Others were locked away in towers or convents, their voices silenced. The higher the rank, the sharper the fall. Not all punishments were official. Families often took matters into their own hands. A brother might threaten his sister's suitor. A father might beat a daughter caught in a barn. A husband might lock his wife away. In some cases, jealousy led to violence, even death. Love was not just a personal matter. It touched the pride and power of entire households. Yet curiously, the same society that punished desire also celebrated it in stories. Troubadour songs praised lovers who braved danger for passion. Romances told of knights who risked their lives, for ladies or queens who secretly loved beneath their crowns. These tales offered an escape, a dream of love stronger than law. But everyone knew the difference between story and life. In real life, punishment was never far. Public shaming left deep marks. Imagine being tied to a post in the market square, jeered at by neighbors, children throwing mud, your name turned into a joke. Imagine being forced to carry a heavy stone through the streets, or to walk barefoot in winter, while people watched. These punishments were meant to scar the memory as much as the body, so that no one would forget. And yet, even under such fear, people continued to risk everything for love. Why? Perhaps because the human heart does not bend easily to law. Perhaps because in a world so full of duty, work, and hardship, moments of tenderness felt worth the danger. Perhaps because love itself was a form of rebellion, a spark of freedom in a world of control. There is a story from France of a young woman punished for loving beneath her station. She was paraded through town wearing a wooden collar, forced to shout her crime to all. Yet as she passed, some villagers whispered words of sympathy, even admiration. They knew the price of love, and perhaps they secretly admired her courage to follow it. Punishment could wound, but it could not erase longing. That was the paradox of the Middle Ages. The rules were harsh, the punishments cruel, yet songs, poems, and whispers kept love alive. In the end, love was not defeated. It simply learned to live in shadows, to hide in festivals, to survive in stories. So when we think of medieval romance, we should remember both sides, the laughter of the maypole and the silence of the stocks, the joy of secret glances and the fear of public shame. Love was both gift and gamble, both sweetness and danger. To fall in love was to risk much, sometimes everything. Yet still, people chose it, again and again. Close your eyes and picture the scene. A couple tied together, walking barefoot through a jeering crowd. Their faces burn with shame, yet their hands remain linked, refusing to let go. Even in punishment, the bond of love holds firm. Perhaps that is why the heart kept daring, even when the world said no. The church and the chains of love in the medieval world. The church was everywhere. Its bells called the hours, its priests marked the seasons, and its teachings guided nearly every part of life. Love and marriage were no exception. Desire was seen not as a private feeling, but as something that needed rules and watchful eyes. If the heart wandered, the church had instructions, confessions, and punishments ready to bring it back in line. Marriage itself became, in time, one of the 7 sacraments, a holy union. But even before that recognition, priests were deeply involved in the rules surrounding who could marry whom, when they could marry, and how they must behave. Love was not left to chance. It was folded into the church's vision of order, sin, and salvation. The rules of marriage first came the laws of who could marry. Blood ties, even distant ones, were considered barriers. A man could not marry his cousin without special permission. Sometimes even 4th cousins were forbidden. These rules often puzzled villagers, who did not always know how far their family tree stretched. In small communities, many people were related in some way, making the church's prohibitions difficult to follow. Yet breaking them risked excommunication, a terrible fate that cut one off from Christian society. There were also rules about consent. By the 12th century, the church taught that true marriage required the consent of both bride and groom. This teaching gave some protection to young people forced into unions, yet in practice, families still held enormous power. Parents arranged matches, and daughters especially were pressured to obey. A whispered yes in a church porch might seal a marriage, but saying no could bring anger, shame, and even violence. Seasons mattered too. Certain times of year, like Lent or Advent, were considered inappropriate for weddings. Couples had to wait, sometimes months, to stand before the altar. This delay was more than a ritual. It was a way for the church to keep control over the rhythm of life, ensuring that marriage did not compete with holy days' confession and control. Then there was confession. Every medieval Christian was expected to confess their sins at least once a year, usually at Easter. Priests heard stories of desire, adultery, and secret meetings. Through confession, the church reached directly into the most private corners of life. Imagine kneeling in the dark corner of a church, whispering to a priest that you had lain with your lover outside marriage, or that you had met someone in secret. The priest might respond with stern words, with penance, or with gentle advice. Sometimes the penance was light, a few prayers, fasting, or giving alms. Other times it could be heavy, a pilgrimage to a faraway shrine, barefoot walks to holy places, or public penance before neighbors. Priests kept lists of questions to ask. Some were startlingly direct. Manuals instructed them to ask if a man had lain with his wife in forbidden places, or at forbidden times, such as during Lent, Sundays, or holy feasts. Couples were told that even within marriage, intimacy should serve the purpose of children, not pleasure. If pleasure was sought too eagerly, it could still be called sinful confession, thus became not only a way to cleanse sins, but also a way to police desire. It taught people where the boundaries lay, reminding them that love was not simply theirs to shape, but something that belonged to the church banns and witnesses. The church also introduced the practice of banns of marriage. Before a wedding, priest would announce the couple's names on 3 Sundays, asking if anyone knew a reason why they could not marry. This was meant to prevent secret unions. to give time for objections, and to show that marriage was not just a private affair, but a matter for the whole community. Witnesses too became important. Marriage was not only between two people, it had to be seen, confirmed, and approved. This public element gave the church more power to enforce its rules. If a couple tried to marry in secret, they risked being told that their union was invalid. Only a marriage recognized by the church carried full weight. Forbidden desire outside marriage was treated as dangerous, but so was desire within it if it broke the rules. Couples were told to avoid intimacy during certain times of year, sometimes nearly half the calendar. Lent, Advent, feast days and Sundays added up to long stretches where passion was forbidden. Husbands and wives might lie side by side but were expected to wait, sometimes for weeks. The rules went further still. Some church writers argued that intimacy was wrong if it happened in the daylight, or if it was enjoyed too much. Others warned against unusual positions or too much eagerness, calling them sins. These teachings may sound harsh to modern ears, but they reflect a world where the body was often seen as weak and prone to temptation, needing constant restraint, trials, and penance. When love broke the rules, the church had its own courts. These were called ecclesiastical courts, and they dealt with cases of adultery, fornication, and even broken promises to marry. A woman who claimed a man had promised to wed her could bring him before such a court, demanding he keep his word. Witnesses would be called, questions asked, and the decision might shape two lives forever. Penance varied. Some were told to fast, others to go on pilgrimage, still others to make public confession. The aim was not only to punish, but to correct, to steer people back into the church's vision of order, web of control. All of these rules, marriage laws, confessions, bans, seasons, and courts, wove a web around love. They turned desire into something watched, measured, and corrected. The church did not ignore love, it claimed it. Marriage became a holy sacrament, and within that sacrament, the church declared itself the guardian of the human heart. And yet, despite this web, people still loved. They still whispered in fields, still slipped into shadows, still dreamed of forbidden kisses. The rules slowed them, frightened them, punished them, but they could not erase desire. In some ways, the strictness of the church made love even more daring, for every kiss carried risk, and every meeting defied authority, the human heart against the rules picture. A young couple in a village. Their families disapprove, the priest warns them. The bans are delayed. The rules forbid marriage in Lent. Still, they meet in the woods at dusk, hands trembling as they hold each other. The church may set chains around love, but the heart beats, stubbornly on, refusing to be silenced. This is the tension at the core of the medieval world. On one side, a church determined to control. On the other, ordinary people whose feelings were too strong to be neatly caged. The rules were real, the punishments sharp, but so was the longing closing reflection. As we listen to these stories from centuries past, we see a pattern. The church tried to take love and turn it into duty, sin, confession, or sacrament. Yet people, whether noble or peasant, continued to find ways to love in secret, to bend the rules, or to bear the punishment for the sake of affection. So when we think of medieval love, we must picture both the priest with his stern questions and the young couple whispering under the stars. Love was chained, but never broken. Rules bound it, yet it slipped through the cracks, flowing like water through stone. And perhaps that is the lesson. Even in the strictest world, the human heart finds a way. Love charms and potions in the Middle Ages. Not every question of love was taken to the priest or the confessional. Sometimes people turned instead to old traditions, whispered spells, and charms passed down from grandmothers. Beneath the ringing of church bells, another world existed, one filled with herbs, symbols, and secret words. This was the world of folk magic, and in matters of love, it was never silent. The desire for control, falling in love, has always been uncertain. Would the other person feel the same? Would families agree? Would fate be kind? In medieval times, when life was already full of hardship and chance, the uncertainty of love was even more frightening. That is why so many people turned to charms and potions. They wanted to tilt luck in their favor, to find some measure of control over the heart of another, herbs and simple spells. Many love charms began with herbs. Some plants were thought to stir desire, others to cool it, others still to bind two hearts together. Rosemary, for example, was believed to bring loyalty. A sprig placed under a pillow was said to make a lover dream of their beloved. Basil was thought to awaken passion, though it was also linked to anger if misused. Rue, on the other hand, was used to drive away unwanted desire, protecting against temptation. Simple spells often involved carrying these herbs in a pouch, wearing them as garlands, or boiling them into teas. Sometimes the act itself was less important than the belief, the hope that a small plant could bend the great weight of fate tokens and objects beyond herbs. People relied on tokens. A lock of hair, a piece of clothing, or even a nail clipping could be used in charms. The idea was simple. Part of a person carried their essence. If you held that part, you held some power over their heart. In some regions, lovers tied knots in ribbons or cords, believing the knots would bind affection. Others baked bread with symbolic shapes, giving it secretly to the one they desired. Even rings and trinkets sometimes carried charms, carved with signs or blessed with whispered words. The church frowned upon these practices, calling them superstition or worse, witchcraft. But among ordinary people, they remained popular. For a young woman in a village, a charm might feel like the only hope when her beloved seemed distant. For a young man, a potion might seem the only way to win the heart of a girl promised to another. Potions and bruise love potions were the most famous and the most feared. Recipes varied from the simple to the strange. Some called for honey and wine, stirred with whispered prayers. Others demanded herbs like vervain or mugwort, mixed into food or drink. There were darker recipes too. Old texts mention brews made with animal parts, even with drops of blood, meant to stir uncontrollable desire. These were risky not only because of their ingredients, but also because of the danger if discovered. To give someone a potion without their knowledge was seen as both sinful and dangerous, an act that could backfire badly, yet the idea of a love potion was powerful. In a world where choice was often limited by family and duty, the thought of bending another's heart seemed tempting. Tales spread of girls who slipped herbs into their suitor's drink, or of men who carried powders to sprinkle in food. Astrology and the starsome lovers looked upward instead of downward. The stars, they believed, guided the fates of men and women. Astrologers drew charts, matching birth signs to see if a union would succeed. Certain days were considered lucky for confessions of love, others unlucky. A girl might be told to declare her feelings when the moon was waxing so that affection would grow. A man might be warned not to approach when Saturn was dominant, for that planet was thought to bring coldness and distance. Even noble courts sometimes consulted astrologers before arranging marriages, hoping to align earthly unions with heavenly patterns, magic and the edge of danger. The line between folk charm and witchcraft was thin. A simple sprig of rosemary was harmless, but when charms grew stranger, suspicion followed. Church sermons often warned against women who claimed to stir love with spells. Such women could be accused of sorcery, and the punishment could be severe. Yet people still whispered, still asked the wise woman at the edge of the village for advice, still carried tokens in hidden pouches. In private, many admitted that love was too strong, too wild, to be controlled only by rules. Magic, even risky magic, felt like a path when all others were closed. Stories of enchantment, medieval tales are full of love charms and potions. In romances, knights sometimes fall under enchantment, loving ladies not by choice, but by spell. In legends, witches give potions that bind lovers together, or curses that drive them apart. These stories reveal how real the fear and hope of such magic felt. 1. famous tale is of Tristan and Isolde. They were not meant to love, but they drank a potion by mistake, and their hearts were bound forever. Their story ends in sorrow, but the idea remained powerful. A potion could change destiny, could bind two souls even against the will of kings, hope, fear, and desire. For us today, love charms may seem like superstition, simple tricks of herbs and symbols. But for people of the Middle Ages, they were serious acts, born of hope and fear. To love someone you could not have was painful. To risk shame, punishment, or heartbreak was frightening. A charm, a token, a potion. These were ways of fighting back, of trying to make fate kinder. Close your eyes and imagine a young woman in a cottage. She takes a sprig of rosemary, tucks it under her pillow, and whispers the name of the boy she longs for. She hopes to dream of him, hopes that in some way the plant will carry her desire across the dark. Whether it worked or not, the act gave her comfort. It gave her hope, and hope, after all, was the strongest magic of all. Closing reflection. So, in the medieval world, love lived under two powers. The church, with its rules, confessions, and sermons, sought to bind it with laws, and folk tradition, with its herbs, charms, and potions, sought to bend it with magic. Between these two forces, the human heart struggled on. Perhaps the lesson is simple. Rules could not kill love. Magic could not guarantee it. But people still tried both, because the longing to love and be loved was greater than fear, greater than doubt, greater even than the risk of punishment. In a crowded cottage, in a noble court, in a village market, the same desire stirred. Love was both fragile and fierce, both controlled and free, and sometimes all it needed was a whispered word, a hidden charm, or the courage to believe. Matchmakers, fortune tellers, and the signs of love in a medieval village, love was rarely left to chance. Families, friends, neighbors, and sometimes strangers all had a hand in guiding hearts toward one another, while the church offered rules and the wise women offered charms. There was another layer of tradition, matchmaking and fortune telling. These practices gave people a way to ask the future, to test fate, and to feel that love could be discovered through signs. The role of matchmakers. Not every couple met by accident. In many places, there were people whose job was to arrange marriages. A matchmaker was often an older woman, someone trusted by the community, who knew the families and their histories. She carried news from one household to another, suggesting unions, whispering possibilities. She might say, "Your daughter is of age, and the miller's son is strong, though poor. Shall I speak to his family?" Or she might remind a young man that the girl across the field has a good dowry, even if her father is stern. These conversations were quiet, careful, and often done in kitchens or doorways. For the matchmaker, it was not just about wealth or land. She also listened for signs of affection. A stolen glance at the village well, a lingering word at the market, a shy smile at church. These were clues she noticed. In her way, she was both practical and romantic, balancing duty with desire, family pressure, and practical matches, of course. Not everyone liked the matchmaker's work. Young people often dreamed of choosing their own partners, but families worried about survival, land, and alliances. Marriage was not only about love, it was about security. This meant that many unions were arranged not because two hearts longed for one another, but because two families saw an advantage. A father might agree to a marriage that joined farms. A mother might push for a son-in-law who could protect her daughter. These matches could be kind, or they could be cold for young people. The tension was real. They might obey, or they might rebel quietly, meeting in secret, seeking charms, or dreaming of another life. And this is where fortune-telling often entered. The picture fortune-telling and the search for signs, if love could not be chosen freely, perhaps it could at least be glimpsed. People sought out ways to predict who they would marry, or when love might arrive. Some of these methods were simple, even playful. Others carried a darker weight, especially when linked with superstition. One common practice was to watch dreams. If a girl placed a sprig of rosemary under her pillow and dreamed of a young man, it was said he might be her future husband. Some places, girls baked dumb cakes in silence on certain nights, believing that if they ate them before bed, their true love would appear in their dreams. Another method involved water and reflection. A girl might peer into a bowl of water at night, hoping to see the face of her future husband in the ripples. Boys too sometimes sought such signs, though the stories often describe young women more openly engaged in these rituals. Seasonal love rituals. Certain times of year were thought to be more powerful for discovering love. Midsummer's Eve was especially rich with rituals. People lit bonfires, danced, and tried charms that revealed the future. It was believed that on such nights, the boundary between worlds was thin, and truths could be glimpsed. Girls might scatter herbs in the fields, whispering names into the wind. Others might watch the smoke of the bonfire, believing it carried messages about love. These customs blended old pagan traditions with newer Christian festivals, creating a mix of joy, superstition, and hope. On May Day, another season of love, people wove garlands and played games of courtship. It was said that the way a flower fell, or the way a ribbon twisted, could signal future matches, omens, and everyday signs. Fortune-telling did not always require rituals. People watched for omens in daily life. If a bird flew across your path in a certain way, it could mean love was near. If you stumbled when walking towards someone, it could be taken as a sign of attraction. In some places, sneezes even carried meaning. If a girl sneezed after hearing a man's name, it might be taken as a sign of fate. Small things, easily overlooked, could become messages when viewed through the lens of longing. These beliefs may sound playful, but they mattered deeply to people who had little control over their marriages. If the stars or signs suggested hope, it gave them strength to endure family decisions, the tension between choice and fate. The heart of all this was a struggle between duty and desire, between what families demanded and what young people hoped for. Matchmakers offered arrangements. Fortune tellers offered glimpses of choice. And between them, people dreamed. Some stories tell of unions made happy by chance, where affection grew after marriage. Others tell of sorrow, where love was lost, hidden, or forbidden. Through it all, the rituals of matchmaking and fortune-telling offered a sense that love was not entirely out of one's hands. A village scene picture, a village at dusk. A group of young women gathers near a stream. They whisper, laugh, and drop small petals into the water. Each petal carries a name. They watch to see whose petal floats fastest, whose turns toward the moon, whose sinks to the bottom. For them, this is not just a game. It is a way of touching the unknown, of asking the world itself for guidance. Meanwhile, at the same time, a matchmaker sits in a cottage. She sips her drink and thinks about which families she should speak to next. She knows the young miller looks often at the blacksmith's daughter. She knows the parents are hesitant. She considers how to arrange her words, how to make the union seem wise. She is both practical and subtle, weaving futures with her voice. And above it all, the church bell rings. Its sound reminds everyone of rules, of sermons, of the order that hovers over all these secret wishes. Yet the bell cannot silence dreams. Not even the loudest bell can stop the heart from hoping. Closing reflection. So, matchmaking and fortune-telling filled a strange middle ground in medieval love. They did not ignore rules, but they slipped between them. They gave people a way to feel less powerless, to believe that choice or destiny might smile on them. It is easy to smile at these customs today, but perhaps they are not so different from how we still read horoscopes, or ask for signs, or hope that fate will push us towards someone. In every age, the human heart has wanted to know who will love me, and when, and how. In the Middle Ages, the answers were found in herbs under pillows, in dreams, in matchmakers' whispers, and in the slow drifting of petals on a stream. Affection in public and private. When we think about romance in the Middle Ages, we often imagine knights writing poetry or noble ladies sending secret tokens. But in most villages, affection was quieter, smaller, and much harder to express. Homes were crowded, privacy was rare, and public rules were strict. Yet couples still found ways to show they cared. These signs of affection, sometimes subtle, sometimes bold, told their own story of love in a world where everyone was always watching. The watchful eyes of the community, life in a medieval village was deeply communal. Neighbors knew one another's business. Children ran in and out of each other's homes, and people worked together in the fields. This closeness meant that love and affection were almost always on display, whether couples wanted it or not. A young man speaking too often with a young woman at the well might draw whispers. A married couple who laughed together too loudly might be scolded by the parish priest for showing wanton familiarity. Even the smallest gestures could spark gossip. Yet this constant watchfulness also meant affection had to be coded. People developed subtle signals, small touches, and quiet words that conveyed more than they revealed. Small gestures. In public, imagine a couple walking to church. They cannot hold hands openly, for that would be judged improper. But the man might carry her bucket for her, or let his cloak brush against her arm. A woman might glance at a man longer than necessary when offering him bread at the market. To outsiders, these gestures looked ordinary. To the couple, they were charged with meaning. Sitting together at feasts or festivals was another way to show closeness. Seating arrangements often reflected status and family ties, but young people found excuses to sit near each other, perhaps helping to serve food or joining the same game or dance. At May Day celebrations or during harvest festivals, such closeness was harder to police, and laughter covered what might otherwise be noticed. Dancing itself became a way of showing affection. Village dances allowed young people to join hands, move in circles, and even pair off briefly. The touch of a hand in a dance could mean far more than the steps themselves. For some, it was the only time they could touch without suspicion. Words and courtesy's affection also found expression in words. A man might address a woman more gently than others. A woman might use playful language, teasing him in front of others, but with a tone only he would recognize as fondness. In a culture where most speech was practical, about work, food, or obligations, these small moments of softness stood out. There were also tokens, a ribbon given before a feast, a sprig of greenery shared after church, or a small baked good carried across the village. These were not expensive gifts, but they spoke volumes. To receive such a thing meant someone had thought of you, had chosen to single you out. Affection. Within the home once married, affection had to adapt to the crowded world of one-room homes. Privacy remained scarce, but couples developed ways of showing love even in shared spaces. Sitting close at the hearth, carving an extra piece of bread for a spouse, or adjusting a blanket on a cold night. All were signs of tenderness. Words spoken in the quiet of the evening, when others were falling asleep, could carry more weight than anything said in daylight. Some couples used humor. Joking, laughing, and storytelling allowed them to share a bond that others might not fully understand. Even children and grandparents in the room could not take away the warmth of two people laughing together. Affection was often practical too. A husband might mend something for his wife without being asked. A wife might save a special piece of food for her husband after a long day in the fields. These acts of care were not dramatic, but they were deeply meaningful in a life of hardship rules. Against public displays, it is important to remember that the church and local courts often discouraged public affection. Kissing in public could be seen as scandalous, even between married couples. Priests reminded the faithful that marriage was sacred and should not be made light of with laughter or flirtation. Court records show fines for indecent behavior, which might include touching too freely at a feast or being caught in a barn together before marriage. These punishments remind us that the community took love very seriously, but as strict as the rules were, they could never fully control human behavior. Couples continued to bend the rules, to steal moments when they could, to risk disapproval. For the sake of affection festivals and exceptions at festivals, rules often loosened. On May Day, couples might slip away into the fields, gathering flowers or branches. Songs and poems from the time described these festivals as moments of joy, when the usual order of life was suspended. During Carnival, just before Lent, laughter and play took over villages. Masks and disguises gave people freedom to flirt, to act boldly, even to kiss in public without being recognized. These short seasons of license were important. They gave couples the chance to show affection more openly, if only for a brief time. The role of courtly love in the noble world. Affection sometimes followed the ideals of courtly love. Knights praised ladies in poetry, wore their tokens into battle, and spoke of devotion that was often more symbolic than real. These practices influenced how ordinary people thought about affection too. Even in villages, songs about knights and ladies circulated. They gave people new ways to imagine love, noble, secret, and devoted. A villager might not write a poem, but he could hum a tune that suggested longing. A woman might think of herself as a lady, waiting for a sign of loyalty, hidden affection, and secrecy. Sometimes affection was not just subtle, but fully hidden. Couples who could not be open because of family disapproval, social class, or existing marriages used secret signs. A stone placed in a certain place, a mark left on a door, or a whispered phrase at the well could signal love. Secrecy carried risks. If discovered, couples might face punishment. Yet secrecy also gave affection an intensity, making small gestures feel powerful. For some, love survived precisely because it had to be hidden. A village example. Imagine once again a village on a summer evening. Children run in the lanes, men gather near the tavern, women finish their tasks at the well. A young couple cannot hold hands, cannot speak too long without being noticed, so the boy offers to carry the girl's jug of water. She lets him, though she could easily manage. Their hands brush briefly, hidden by the weight of the jug. They do not speak of love, at least not in words, but when she thanks him with a smile, the meaning is clear. Later, at the harvest feast, they join the dance. For only a few moments, their hands meet openly. The music covers their laughter, and the crowd gives them a space that daily life never could. Reflection. Affection in the Middle Ages was both difficult and creative. Couples lived under the gaze of neighbors, priests, and family, yet they still found ways to show love. Through gestures, gifts, words, and shared laughter, they carved out small spaces of intimacy. Today we may take for granted the freedom to hold hands, to kiss in public, to live in private homes. In the medieval world, each small act of affection carried weight. It was an act of courage, of creativity, and of persistence. Love did not vanish because life was crowded and rules were strict. Instead, it adapted. And in those adaptations, those small touches, those secret smiles, we see how deeply human the longing for closeness has always been. Love in song, story, and memory. In the quiet of medieval life, where homes were crowded and rules were strict, there was another space where love could breathe more freely. This space was not physical, but cultural, the world of song, poetry, and storytelling. Through music and tales, people could imagine love larger than their own lives, more poetic than the daily struggle, more private than a one-room cottage ever allowed. The power of music was a part of daily life in the Middle Ages. Villagers sang as they worked, children sang games in the lanes, and travelling minstrels brought news and entertainment. Within this music, love often took center stage. Songs about longing, about waiting for someone, or about secret meetings under the moon carried themes that everyone understood. Some were playful, teasing about flirtations. Others were mournful, speaking of distance and loss. Even if someone had never left their village, they could still feel the pull of these words, because the emotions were universal. At feasts, musicians played lutes, fiddles, or simple flutes, and couples listened together. Even when they could not touch, the music itself joined them. A love song sung in the hall gave them permission to feel what they might not dare say aloud. Poetry and courtly love. Among nobles and in courts, poetry became a refined art of affection. Troubadours in southern France, minnesingers in Germany, and poets in England all wrote verses that praised women with devotion. These poems described love as a noble suffering, a test of loyalty, a fire that could not be hidden. While this courtly love was often more idealized than real, its influence reached beyond castles. Ordinary people heard these poems sung by minstrels, and the language of devotion spread. Even a villager who never saw a knight might still hear of the noble lady whose beauty was compared to the morning star. This shaped how people thought about affection. Love was not only about survival or family duty, it could also be imagined as beautiful, poetic, and transcendent. Even if a peasant's affection was shown through bread or blankets, the language of songs allowed them to think of it as part of something greater. Stories by the hearth. Beyond music and poetry, storytelling carried love through the generations. Families gathered around the hearth and tales were told. Sometimes of saints who resisted temptation, sometimes of lovers who defied the odds. These stories were moral lessons, but they were also entertainment. One evening, a grandmother might tell the story of Tristan and Isolde, a tragic romance full of longing and fate. On another night, a tale of a faithful wife who waited for her husband's return from war might be shared. Children listened with wide eyes, but so did young men and women, hearing their own feelings echoed in ancient voices. Through these tales, people learned not only what love could be, but also what it cost, what risks it carried, and why it mattered. Affection through symbols. Music and story gave couples a secret language. A man might hum a tune that carried words he could not say openly. A woman might quote a line from a poem, letting her beloved know she felt the same. These were codes, woven into culture, available even in crowded rooms. Imagine a woman at her spinning wheel, softly singing a verse about a bird longing for its mate. Her husband hears, and though the children chatter around them, he understands the hidden message. Or imagine a young man carving a symbol into wood, inspired by a tale he once heard. To others, it is decoration. To the one who knows, it is a confession. The church and love songs. The church sometimes frowned upon love songs, especially those that were playful or suggestive. Priests worried that such songs led to temptation. But music could not be silenced. Even in monasteries, monks wrote poems that spoke of love. Though often cloaked in the language of devotion to God, the line between sacred and romantic blurred. Some melodies that began as prayers found their way into village songs of affection. People used the same tunes to carry both piety and passion. This overlap shows how deeply love, in all its forms, was woven into the medieval heart. The continuity of love through music, poetry, and story. Medieval people carried love across time. A couple who could not speak freely still had songs to share. A girl whose marriage was arranged still had stories to dream with. A man who felt the weight of duty still found space to imagine devotion. In this way, affection survived not only in gestures and whispers, but also in memory and imagination. Love was both practical and poetic, both daily and eternal. A closing scene picture once more a medieval village at night. The fire burns low, the family settles into their shared bed of straw. The goat shifts in the corner. A mother hums a tune to soothe her child. The words are about a knight and his lady, but the melody softens the whole room. Beside her, her husband listens. He does not say anything, but his hand rests lightly on hers. In that moment, the song, the story, the touch, and the silence all join together. Love does not need walls to exist. It needs presence, memory, and the smallest acts of care. Final reflection. So how did couples find intimacy in one-room medieval homes? Through secrecy, through creativity, through resilience. They used curtains and signals, laughter and patience, gifts and gestures. They bent rules, trusted omens, and found ways to express affection where privacy did not exist. And beyond all this, they had music, poetry, and stories, voices that carried love higher than walls, longer than nights, further than the limits of their homes. In the end, medieval love was not about grand gestures. It was about finding one another in the crowd, whispering in the noise and creating a space where two hearts could meet, even when the world gave them no room at all. As you rest now, think of those couples long ago who found closeness in the smallest ways. Their world was crowded, yet their hearts were not. Love endured, quiet but steady, like a song carried through the centuries. And so, we come to the end of our quiet journey into the one-room homes of the Middle Ages. We have wandered through crowded cottages where families, animals, and possessions all shared the same smoky air. We have seen how couples searched for privacy where none existed, how they hung cloths and whispered in the dark, how they stole moments of tenderness in barns, fields, or behind a simple curtain. We have listened to the voices of the church, of matchmakers, of storytellers, and of poets who shaped how people thought about love. Through every segment, one truth has lingered. Love did not vanish in hardship. It adapted. It found life in gestures, in signals, in songs, and in memory. Even when watched by neighbors, even when pressed close by family, affection still found a way. And as you rest now, you might feel comfort in that endurance. Across centuries, across cultures, across the noise of crowded rooms, the human need for closeness has remained. It is steady, patient, and deeply familiar. So let your mind settle. Let the weight of the past drift away. The story of medieval love belongs to another time, yet it reminds us of something timeless. That even in difficult places, people sought kindness, warmth, and connection. Thank you for joining this journey through history. If you have enjoyed this quiet exploration, consider subscribing to Boring History for Sleep. There are many more nights of gentle stories waiting for you, more moments where history becomes a soft companion to rest. For now, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the past fade into dreams. The story is complete, and the night is yours.